Hello everybody and welcome to my Lord of the Rings draft guide. In this video, I'm going to be providing you with all of the information you need to find success in your Lord of the Rings drafts. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, I will provide archetype overviews, discuss the combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, the new mechanics are the ring and amass orcs. The first new mechanic is the ring, which is reflected by the text, the ring tempts you. So on Birthday Escape, you draw a card and the ring tempts you. As the ring tempts you, you get an emblem named the ring if you don't have one. Then your emblem gains its next ability. Don't worry, I'll be showing you exactly what that emblem looks like in a moment. And you choose a creature you control to become or remain your ring bearer. It's worth noting that the ring can tempt you even if you don't control a creature. The ring gains its abilities in order from the top to the bottom, and once it gains an ability, it has it for the rest of the game. Each time the ring tempts you, you must choose a creature if you control one, and each player can only have one emblem named the ring and only one ring bearer. So what does the ring do? Well, it is this emblem that starts by making your ring bearer legendary, and so it can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. Then, whenever your ring bearer attacks, draw a card, then discard a card. The third ability is whenever your ring bearer becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller sacrifices it at the end of combat. And then the final ability is whenever your ring bearer deals combat damage to a player, each opponent loses 3 life. And remember that it gains the abilities, it doesn't lose the previous abilities as you go through this progression. The next new mechanic is amass orcs, and it is fairly straightforward. There are cards that say amass orcs, and then they'll be followed by a number. So for example, Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant says amass orcs 1, and so that means that you put a +1/+1 counter on an army you control. It's also an orc. If you don't control an army, you create a 0/0 black orc army token creature first, and then you put the counters on it. So Gothmog Morgul Lieutenant will either put a +1/+1 counter onto an existing army you control, or it will make a new army and make that army into a 1/1 essentially. And then Gothmog also gives creature tokens, which will include your orc army, Death Touch. So it's worth noting that this army is a token. Moving on to the top commons and starting things off with white. At number 1 is Hobbit's Sting. It's a fairly efficient instant speed removal spell in white, and while it is situational and won't always do what you want it to do, it is very impressive when it does kill your opponent's creatures, which means that it is worth taking early and making sure that you make gameplay decisions to keep creatures and keep food tokens in play for as long as possible if you do have Hobbit's Sting in your deck. At number 2 is Protector of Gondor, just a great way to put 2 bodies into play for 1 card. They're both humans, which is also relevant in this set, and overall, it's just the sort of card that doesn't necessarily look impressive, but that plays out very, very well. At number 3 is Errand Rider of Gondor, a nice 3-mana 3/2 that's going to get you card selection or even card advantage if you do have a legendary creature in play. So if you are taking Errand Rider of Gondor, make sure that you take some legendary creatures as well. Next up, we have blue, and at number 1 is Glorious Gale, a great counterspell that also lets the ring tempt you in some situations. We've seen this effect before, and the addition of the ring being able to tempt you is pure upside on a spell that has already been great historically, so Glorious Gale is a fantastic card. At number 2 is Ithilien Kingfisher, a nice little flyer that will get you some card advantage when it dies, which means that it'll be able to pressure your opponents, and then when they do kill it or you do trade it off, you're going to recoup some card advantage. At number 3 is Isolation of Orthanc, an instant speed removal spell for blue, which is really just what you're looking for, and it's worth noting that this is particularly relevant against army tokens, because if you do kill their army token with this, it won't go into their library, it'll just be dead for good. Next up is black. At number 1 is Claim the Precious. 3 mana to destroy their creature and have the ring tempt you is just a fantastic rate for a removal spell, and so this will be a high priority. At number 2 is Dunland Crebain, which is just really nice because it can make you 2 bodies for 1 card, or just get you a good amount of stats for 1 card if you do already have an army. But on turn 3, a lot of the time you're going to be getting a 1/1 flyer and a 2/2 ground creature, which is just a very nice card. At number 3 is Easterling Vanguard, a 2-drop that might not look as impressive, but it does kind of get you 2 bodies for 1 card, and is especially good if you have some sacrifice shenanigans, or don't mind if the Easterling Vanguard dies and trades off and things like that. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Smite the Deathless, a very good removal spell. 2 mana to deal 3 damage at instant speed is quite nice and is just pretty efficient. Exiling is also nice upside in certain situations. At number 2 is Rally the Hornberg, 2 mana for 2 1/1 creatures, and even giving those creatures haste is quite nice because on turn 2 you'll be able to start chipping in for some damage, and it's also just nice if you have some sacrifice shenanigans or equipments or anything of that nature. At number 3 is Haradrim Spearmaster. 3 mana for a 2/3 reach is not the best stat line, but the fact that you're going to be able to buff your other creatures every single turn without sinking mana into this is really nice. It plays well with tokens. It just plays well at enabling attacks in your aggressive decks, and it also stacks well with itself, where if you start putting +1/+0 2 times, if you have multiple Haradrim Spearmasters in play, it's pretty nice as well. Finally, we have green. At number 1 is Many Partings, which is 1 mana to get a basic land card and create a food token. It might not look that impressive, but these sorts of cards always play out very, very well because the ability to generate a resource while also just getting a land from your deck is incredibly powerful. It can enable splashes, it can help you fix your colors so you don't get color screwed, and it can also help you enable food synergies without you having to put dedicated cards in your deck just to generate food. This card makes food as an upside on an effect that is already pretty solid, and as a result, Many Partings is going to be a card that, if you take it early, will allow you to do some very cool things in deck building and make your decks better overall. At number 2 is Generous Ent, the perfect stabilization card for your more mid-ranging or controlling green decks. It is going to be a 6 mana 5/7 reach, which just basically brick walls anything on the ground or in the air. It creates a food token, which can enable synergies or just sacrifice itself to gain you some life to stabilize you in those late game situations. And also, it has forest cycling, so even if you draw it in the early turns of the game, you're just able to cycle it away to continue hitting your land drops. It's absolutely fantastic that your late game green creature can also be an early game land drop so that it is useful at all stages of the game. Finally, at number 3 is Ent's Fury, a really nice removal spell for green decks, particularly if you have some bigger creatures, which green decks often do have. You're going to be able to get a lot of value from your 2 mana removal spell. Green sometimes does lack interaction, so making sure you have a couple copies of Ent's Fury in your green decks is really nice. Next, we're going to be talking about color rankings. It is worth noting that these are best used as a tiebreaker for a close pick, as all of the colors are quite powerful, and it is going to be best to find the open color and draft that deck rather than just forcing the color that is the best. At number 1 is blue, at number 2 is green, at number 3 is white, at number 4 is black, and at number 5 is red. As I said, if the color is open, it is going to be worth drafting as they are all fairly close. Moving on to the archetype overviews, starting off with red-white. It is a human token aggro deck, which can use a lot of creatures in play and then buff those creatures up and swing for the win. It gets to use Theoden, King of Rohan, which is great because whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, you can give one of your creatures double strike, and double strike just helps you push tons of damage. Erkenbrand is also fantastic because when he or another human enters play, you buff all of your creatures. And then Shadowfax is a great top-end card for this deck because when it can attack, it can put another creature into play, and overall you can just push tons of damage, sometimes out of nowhere if your opponent doesn't expect the haste. Next is blue-black, which is in a mass control deck. It gains access to the Mouth of Sauron, which is a really nice 5-drop, which will put some cards into your graveyard to fuel graveyard synergies, and then you get to amass orcs, which is going to be hopefully a sizable body as well. You also gain access to a card like Gandalf, Friend of the Shire, which is great in a control shell because it lets you hold up your mana on your opponent's turn and cast some sorceries that they maybe don't expect to blow them out with your removal spells and things like that. And then finally, Voracious Fellbeast is the perfect top-end card for this sort of control deck because it'll make you a food token to help you stabilize and also kill one of your opponent's creatures. Next is green-white, which is a Hobbit food aggro deck. Hobbits are represented by halfling on the creature type, just in case that is confusing. You gain access to Butterbur Bree Innkeeper, which is going to be generating you food tokens, as long as you don't already have one, which is pretty nice because there are plenty of ways to use food tokens in this Hobbit deck, and not just to gain life. You also gain access to Meriadoc Brandybuck, which lets you generate food when you attack your opponent with a Hobbit. And then Rosy Cotton of South Lane is a great use for food tokens entering the battlefield because you're able to buff up your other creatures whenever those foods come into play. Next up is blue-red, which is a spells deck that sometimes cares about casting multiple spells in a turn. Gandalf's Sanction is really nice because you're able to kill your opponent's creature and deal some damage to them in the process if you have built your deck with enough instants and sorceries. Saruman the White is a really nice top-end card for this deck because if you are casting multiple spells each turn, you are going to be able to start amassing, and that's going to be very helpful for you. And then finally, Ranger's Firebrand is a card that is very good in this sort of deck because you're really looking for cheap plays that are instants or sorceries that won't have you fall behind on the board so that you can fill your graveyard with instants and sorceries, but your opponent is still not going to be just able to run you over while you're drawing cards or things like that. Next up is black-green, which is a graveyard deck that also has some sacrifice shenanigans going on. Old Man Willow is a nice card for this deck because it's a 4/4 when it first comes into play on turn 4, but it will grow over the course of the game, and when it attacks, you can sacrifice a creature or token, so it's noteworthy that you can sacrifice a food token to this to then shrink opposing creatures or just kill them, hopefully. Rise of the Witch King is another nice card for this deck because both players sacrifice a creature, but you're going to know it's coming, so you can set it up to sacrifice one of your weaker creatures, and then you get back a really good permanent from your graveyard in the ideal scenario. Shortcut to Mushrooms is also a nice card in this deck because if you do have some sacrifice shenanigans going on, or you have some foods that you're going to be sacrificing, then you can start putting counters on your creatures. Next up is blue-white, which is a deck that cares about flying and also has some draw 2 synergies. Gwaihir the Windlord is an excellent card in this deck because it's going to be a flyer with vigilance that gives your other birds vigilance, and also you can cast it for cheap if you've drawn 2 or more cards in the turn. Landreval Horizon Witness is also great in this deck because when you play it on turn 5 and then you immediately attack with 2 creatures, you can give one of them flying, and if you already have one of them be flying, then you can give basically your only ground creature flying while attacking with a flyer and a non-flyer or things of that nature, which is pretty nice. Prince Imrahil the Fair is also a great card in this deck because you can play it on turn 2, and then as you draw extra cards, you'll be generating tokens to help keep the ground stable while you win with your flyers. Next is red-green, which is a deck that cares about ramp and big creatures. Because it cares about ramp, it is oftentimes going to be splashing some powerful cards in other colors, which is just something to note anytime you do have a ramp strategy. Strider Ranger of the North is a great card in this deck because whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to buff your creature, and if it's a big creature, then it'll gain first strike, which makes it basically impossible to block because a 5/5 first strike is just really, really hard to deal with. Eomer of the Rittermark is also fantastic in this deck because it comes into play, and if you have the biggest creature, which you often will at that point, you can attack your opponent and then make a 1/1 blocker, which can either chump block your opponent or otherwise slow them down so that you can be attacking your opponent while not worrying about getting raced. Entish Restoration is also a great card in this deck because for 3 mana, you're going to be able to ramp yourself, fix your mana for splashes or anything like that, and you can get even more ramp if you play it in the mid game when you already have a sizable creature. Next up is white-black, which is a deck that cares about tokens and sacrifice and then a little bit of legendary creatures mattering, and then it also has some cards that have the ring tempt you, so it does a lot of little things, but they all synergize very well. Denethor Ruling Steward is a great card in this deck because at your end step, if a creature died either from sacrifice or combat, you're going to be able to create a 1/1, which you can use to further fuel your engine, and you can also sacrifice creatures to slowly drain your opponent out. Shadow Summoning is just an incredibly efficient spell that you gain access to in this strategy because 2 1/1s flying for 2 mana is just very good, even if they come into play tapped. And then Grima Wormtongue is a card that can do a lot of work in this sort of strategy, sacrificing creatures to slowly drain your opponent out, and if you're sacrificing legendaries, you even get to amass orcs too. Next is blue-green, which is an elf deck that cares about scrying while tempoing your opponents out of the game. Arwen Undomiel is absolutely fantastic in this deck because it's a 2-drop that gets to grow itself or your other creatures whenever you scry. Celeborn the Wise is also great in this deck because when you attack with an elf, you get to scry, which will fuel your synergies, and when you scry, Celeborn will grow as well. Elrond is also fantastic in this deck because it makes you scry when it enters the battlefield, and then whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you'll also scry, and if you're doing a lot of scrying, the ring will be tempting you, and overall, it's just the perfect fit for this deck where you really care about elves and scrying. The final archetype is black-red, which is a deck that cares about amassing an orc army and also doing some sacrifice shenanigans. Mauher Uruk-hai Captain is the perfect card for this deck because it's an aggressively statted 2-mana 2/2 menace that also makes it so that whenever you are amassing, you're going to be getting extra counters onto your army. Ugluk of the White Hand is also great because when your creatures die, you get to grow Ugluk, and if the creature was a goblin or orc, you get to put 2 counters on Ugluk instead. So if you're sacrificing your army or your army is trading off in combat, Ugluk is going to be getting quite big. Foray of the Orcs is also a great card in this sort of deck because as you're growing a big army, you can use Foray of the Orcs as a way to continue growing that army while also killing your opponent's creatures. Next up, we're going to be talking about the combat tricks at common that you should be aware of so you don't get blown out. In white, there is Escape from Orthanc for 1 mana and Second Breakfast for 3 mana. In blue, there is Deceive the Messenger for 1 mana and Dreadful as the Storm for 3 mana. In black, there is Shelob's Ambush for 1 mana and Orcish Medicine for 2 mana. In red, there is Rush the Room for 1 mana and Gimli's Fury for 2 mana. Green has 3 combat tricks. For 1 mana, it has Pippin's Bravery. For 2 mana, it has Bombadil's Song. And for 3 mana, it has Galadrim Bow. So these are the sorts of cards you want to be aware of so you don't get blown out when your opponent attacks you and you make a block without knowing what tricks they could have. These are some trap cards you should be avoiding in the set. Ringsight is first up, and while a lot of the time these gold uncommons are powerful signposts that tell you what a color combination is trying to do, Ringsight is just an incredibly weak effect and often does nothing if you have no legendary creatures. Rising of the Day looks like it might be good in an aggressive shell, but you generally want to be playing a proactive threat on turn 3 rather than a card that's going to set you up for the future, and Haste is just overall not the most powerful ability because it doesn't help you push through if your opponent has some good blockers available. Finally, Oath of the Grey Host is just way too slow for the ultimate effect you end up getting, and even though sagas are oftentimes very, very powerful, Oath of the Grey Host is better left on the sidelines. Next up are some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons in the set. First is Erkenbrand, Lord of Westfold, plus Rally at the Hornburg. Erkenbrand says, when Erkenbrand or another human enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Rally at the Hornburg makes 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens that gain haste until end of turn. So if you have Erkenbrand in play and you play Rally at the Hornburg, you're going to be triggering Erkenbrand twice and making all of your creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn, and those rally tokens will even have haste, so you're going to be hitting your opponent for at least 11 damage if you have no other creatures in play, which is absolutely a fantastic combo to try and assemble. Next is the combo between Brandywine Farmer and Slip on the Ring. Brandywine Farmer says, when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, create a food token, and Slip on the Ring exiles a creature you own, then returns it to the battlefield under your control. The ring tempts you. So if you play the Brandywine Farmer, you'll get a food, and then you slip on the ring, the Brandywine Farmer, it'll leave play, you make another food, and then it'll come back into play, and it'll make another food, and then you even get to have the ring tempt you to boot, and the Brandywine Farmer is a pretty good ring bearer as it is a 1/1. So just a nice little combo to be aware of in your food decks. Next is the combo between Éowyn, Lady of Rohan, and Dunedain Blade. Éowyn says that equip abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate. Dunedain Blade only costs 1 if it's equipping to a human. Éowyn is a human, so you can play your Dunedain Blade on turn 2. On turn 3, play Éowyn, equip the Dunedain Blade for free, and all of a sudden you have a 3-mana 4/5 that has First Strike and Vigilance because of Éowyn's other abilities, which is just quite a powerful threat for that early in the game. Finally, we have the combo between Grishnach, Brash Instigator, and Lash of the Balrog. When Grishnach enters the play, you can basically steal one of your opponent's creatures, and then Lash of the Balrog lets you sacrifice a creature to destroy another creature, and so you just play Grishnach, steal your opponent's creature, then play Lash of the Balrog to sacrifice that creature. It's the classic steal and sack combo. Now we'll be looking at the mana fixing available at common in the set. First is Shire Terrace, which is a fantastic piece of fixing because it doesn't have to take a spell slot in your deck in order for you to get some mana fixing. You just play the Shire Terrace, and then when you have an extra mana lying around, sacrifice it to get a basic land of your choosing. Next is Great Hall of the Citadel, which is not the best piece of fixing, but if you are trying to play a particular legendary spell off the splash, you can use Great Hall of the Citadel in a pinch. Many Partings, as we already discussed, is a great piece of fixing in green. And then if you aren't in green and looking for fixing, Wizard's Rockets can be a one-shot way to get the color you need, and Inherited Envelope can be a little bit of ramp that also fixes for any color you need. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is that some cards care about if you control a legendary creature, so prioritize them a bit more. It's sometimes hard in a vacuum to know, oh, this legendary creature will buff my other cards a little bit, so if you see those legendary creatures and it's a close pick, oftentimes leaning towards the legendary will be correct. The final tip I have is that amass cards are generally best when making a new token, so trading off the army is generally good. If you think about it, you would generally rather be making a new 2/2 token than putting 2 counters onto an existing token you have, and so if you have that sort of option where, oh, I can trade my army off and then play my amass card, or play my amass card and then attack with my army and it won't trade off, it's generally better to get that extra resource, get the extra creature, and trade off your amass card and then make a new army token, though oftentimes it will come down to the particular situation. This is just a good default. That is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag Lord of the Drafts in the comment section down below. That's going to do it for this one. I look forward to seeing you in Middle-earth drafting Magic the Gathering, and I will talk to you next time.